Yesterday, as was mentioned, I did talk a bit about how to reverse diabetes and lose weight. We've been going through this program, and I call it Life Colors because each color represents a way of reversing a disease. And today, we're going to try and do two in the short time, the green and the yellow, that is cancer. What can we do about cancer? What can we do about autoimmune diseases? I'd like to take you back to the late 1970s when the Premier of China was dying from liver cancer. Now, as he was dying, he did something quite interesting. He said, I want to find out why are people dying from cancer in China? So he did a survey of the entirety of China. And the wonderful thing about being a totalitarian state, everybody had to answer. If you didn't answer, you go to prison. In fact, this was the biggest ever human health study done in history. It took over 880 million people. The number of researchers was over 600,000. So to this day, there's never been a bigger health study. And what did they find out? Well, they found out that cancer rates differ in different parts of the country. In one area, rates of cancer could be 1 in 3, 1 in 4, a bit like what we have. But just in adjacent areas, people will have 1 in 100,000 incidents of cancer. And they say, well, why? What's the difference? And they realized that the richest parts of China had the highest rates of cancer. The poorest places in China had hardly any cancer. Now, how can that be? And they tried to think about it. Was it in the water? Was it in the air? What was going on? And they realized that a big study could come out of this. In fact, it was called the China Study. And the conclusion they came to was quite simple. It was that the more animal fat and protein in your diet, the higher your risk of cancer. I can see some of you looking a bit disturbed by that. This is the truth. In fact, the people who were doing the research didn't believe it. They had to do further experiments to prove it. How can it be that eating meat and milk and all of those things, how can that actually cause cancer? Well, it was true. But let me just take you back a bit. What on earth is cancer anyway? We hear the word cancer. What is it? Well, if I was to ask you how many cells do you have in your body, if you were to guess, how many would you guess? Anybody? How many cells, roughly? Trillions, that's actually right. It's about 50 trillion cells we have in the body. Each one of those cells has your copy of DNA. And on those cells, you've got 50,000 genes. So imagine this, 50 trillion cells, each with 50,000 genes. And if one of those genes goes wrong, you can get cancer. 50 trillion times 50,000. You must wonder why we don't all get cancer all the time. So all it is when the cell starts to replicate and doesn't stop. That is cancer. Now here's something you may not know, that we all have cancer. Did you know that? All of us sitting here, even newborn babies, we have cancerous cells in our bodies. The reason why we don't get the disease is because we have a wonderful immune system that seeks out and destroys the cancer, but we all have cancerous tissues in our bodies. In fact, I look at it as one battle lost as opposed to millions of battles won. That's what cancer is. I also like to think of cancer as a weed in the garden. It's just something you don't want growing in your garden. And if you want to get rid of the weed, you're going to have to learn how do you destroy the weed, get rid of it, and make sure it doesn't come back. And what does this weed, this cancer, what does it like to eat? Anybody know? Cancer loves sugar. In fact, a cancerous cell will consume 20 times the level of sugar that your normal cell will do. So that starts to give us an indication, well, what can we do about it? And we'll come back to that. But let me go back to this study, because it showed there are different rates of cancer all over the world. And what is it dependent on? You can see in this graph, On the bottom x-axis, you've got the amount of animal fat you take in. On the y-axis is the rate of breast cancer. And you can see there's a line going along. Right at the bottom in the corner, you've got countries like Thailand and El Salvador, very low rates of animal fat that they consume, very low rates of breast cancer. Then you go all the way up the list, up to New Zealand, Denmark, UK. High levels of animal fat, high levels of breast cancer. There's a linear correlation. Similar with other cancers, even colon cancer. You increase the amount of daily meat consumption, you increase the amount of colon cancer. Let me show you this graph. Now I'll tell you, from this map of the world, the red areas are where there are high rates of cancer, breast cancer. Then down to orange, then yellow, then light green, then dark green. Dark green has the lowest rate of breast cancer. What do you notice about this map of the world? Which countries have the highest rates of cancer? The ones we consider the wealthiest. America, Europe, Australia. In fact, these are some of the countries that people are dying to get into. But when they get there, they realize that they're dying of cancer much more often. And it's not genetic, because you take somebody from India and you take them to Australia, their rate of cancer goes all the way up to the levels of the Australians. It's not genetic, it's about lifestyle, it's about what we eat, what we drink, and how we work together. I don't know if you recognize this lady. You recognize her? Some of you do. She's a famous actress, Angelina Jolie. Well, she went to her doctor many years ago, and they said to her, you have the gene for breast cancer, the gene. In other words, you have a high risk, a 90% chance of getting breast cancer because you have the gene for it. So what she did, she removed her breasts because she didn't want to get breast cancer. But what they didn't tell her was there is a study. And this study showed that if you have this gene for breast cancer and you were born before 1940, you have a 24% chance of getting breast cancer by the age of 50. If you were born after 1940, your risk went all the way up to 67%. In fact, today, women with that mutated gene, they have a risk in the 90s. Now, why do you think that should be? Any significance of 1940? What was going on in 1940? We had World War II, exactly. Now, in many countries, and I know I've seen the pictures of Great Britain was relatively poor. We had to have rations. You couldn't eat what you wanted to eat. There was hardly any sugar or chocolate or milk. And at that time, when Britain was at its poorest, its cancer rates were at its lowest. Its diabetes rates were at its lowest. Today, there are no rations in Britain. You know, you can see children having Coca-Cola, chocolate all day long. The rates of cancer go up. But here it's saying, look, even if you have a programmed gene for cancer, your lifestyle, what you eat, what you consume, how you live, can overthrow the gene. We call it in the area of science epigenetics, above the genes. You may have a gene for a cancer, but your lifestyle can still control that cancer. Because you have the gene doesn't mean you'll have the cancer. So, how do I prevent it? Okay, I'm not giving you the whole story, I have limited time, but there are certain things that you can do to help prevent cancer. One of the things is high dose vitamin D3. High dose vitamin D3. Now, you may realize that we get vitamin D from where? Where do we get it from? From the sun, right. And many of us are exposed to the sun, especially here in Kenya. If you go back to Great Britain right now, it's freezing cold. It's so lovely to be here in Kenya where we have the sun. So we can get it from the sun, but if you don't get enough, what you should be doing is taking a supplement of vitamin D3, 10,000 or somewhere between 5 and 10,000 international units per day. Also, something else you can do is take high dose, relatively high dose, vitamin C, 2 grams per day. So I've also told you, though, cancer loves sugar. So the more you stay away from sugar, the better you will be. Now, what if I already have cancer? What on earth should I do? Yes. So look at the treatments. Now, I'm not telling you to avoid the doctors. You must use the medical professionals. If you have a lump or a cancer, it should be removed most of the time. It should be removed. Now, sometimes when they're talking about things like chemotherapy, ask them, is immunotherapy available? Immunotherapy. This uses your own immune system to attack the cancer. Has far fewer side effects. That's one of the best developments in cancer therapy that I've seen thus far. Now, I get asked this an awful lot. Can I go the natural way? I have cancer. I have severe cancer. What about going the natural way with prayer? Now, does prayer work, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, of course prayer works. Prayer can heal. I'm sure you, and certainly I, have seen healing just by the word of prayer. God can do anything he wants to do in anybody's life, absolutely. But I want to take you back to a gentleman who you may have heard of in the Bible. His name was King Hezekiah. You remember him? King Hezekiah. Now, King Hezekiah was told by the Lord that he was going to die. He was told he was going to die. And so he wasn't happy about it. He cried, he pleaded. And then God said, okay, you're going to live an extra 15 years. Now, when God says you're not going to die, that's it. You're not going to die, right? Okay, but he did instruct him to do something. He instructed him to take a poultice of figs and put it on his leg. Okay. Now, God didn't need to do that. When he says something, it's done. But sometimes he wants you to use the medicine of the day, which is what that poultice was. All I'm saying is, yes, God will heal, but sometimes we can be a bit presumptuous about how he's going to heal us. He may decide he wants to heal you through medicine. He may decide he wants to heal you just through the word of God. But we have to leave that to him. So don't just say, I know how I want to be healed. We have to prayerfully leave it to the Lord. Okay, I have a little bit of time. I'm going to go over into autoimmune. Now, have you ever heard of autoimmune disease? Autoimmune disease? Have you ever heard of anemia? Yes, you've heard of thyroid disease. Yes, type 1 diabetes, multiple sclerosis. All of these weird diseases that affect our bodies. Wherever we have tissues in the body, our antibodies, rather than just attacking viruses and bacteria, sometimes it can attack us. And that's an autoimmune disease. Anywhere in the body it can happen. And here's the thing about autoimmune disease. It affects people who are, like many of us, who are dark, more than the people who are light, especially if you live in a northern hemisphere country. And it affects women much more than men. So black women get these diseases much more than any other people on earth, especially you'll find if they're living up in North America or in Europe. So what is causing it and how do we get it? Well, it starts in the gut. You see, your gut is designed to keep out certain materials and absorb other materials. And any time you are stressed or you're on certain medication or you have a virus, the gut can become a little bit leaky and it can let larger proteins in. If the larger proteins go in, your immune system identifies these larger proteins as foreign and then starts to attack it. And then it will start to look around for any other part of your body that looks like what it's just attacked. Okay, so when it does that, that's when you have an autoimmune disease. Right. What makes autoimmune disease worse? Sugar. Again, sugar causes inflammation. It causes inflammation of your gut and causes inflammation of any organ that is inflamed. The more sugar you have, the worse it will get. In certain autoimmune diseases, wheat will cause inflammation. I would say specifically for people who have thyroid disease, they need to avoid wheat. Now, if you want to have something with wheat in it, you can go for the ancient grains or spelt or something like that. But the traditional wheat, especially for people with thyroid disease, you need to avoid it. And again, the biggest culprit is milk. If you have an autoimmune disease, the one thing you must do is eliminate cow's milk. And some people say, well, what about goat's milk? I say, no, not goat's milk. Leave that for the kids, okay? Some of you understand what I'm talking about. Fair enough. But we've known this for a very long time. You can see this from the New England Journal of Medicine. It showed that type 1 diabetes, that's the one that children get, is triggered by bovine proteins. In other words, by cow proteins, especially cow's milk. Sometimes we wonder, why do our children get diabetes? One of the biggest causes, not the exclusive cause, but one of the biggest causes is that it's an autoimmune against cow's milk. And one thing that you must not forget when it comes to autoimmunity, it is stress. You know, when you are stressed, everything comes out worse. In fact, many people don't know they have an autoimmune disease until they go for a very stressful period, and then the disease comes out. So, there you go. And look at this. Out of interest, this is a map of the world for multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis. The highly coloured areas are where there is lots of autoimmune disease, all up here. Scandinavia, North Canada. Along this line, the equator, there's hardly any autoimmune disease along the equator. And that tells you the power of the sun again. The more sun you expose yourself to, the fewer incidents of autoimmune disease you get, especially multiple sclerosis. And people say, well, why are you coming to Africa talking to us about sun and autoimmune disease? Well, that's a good point. But I will ask you to reflect on your lifestyles in Africa. So we get all suited up. We go to our office in our air-conditioned cars. We go back to our air-conditioned homes. We're very rarely exposed to the sun. So because of that, we rarely get enough of the vitamin D that we need. Enough vitamin D from the sun, from usually the poorer people, not the executives, usually the poorer people who are exposed enough so that they can overcome any autoimmune disease. And that's irrespective of their diets, by the way. Having enough vitamin D from the sun protects them. So let me just give you a rehearsal of how you can help to reverse an autoimmune disease. So avoid all the dairy and the wheat, especially avoid sugar as well. And that means fizzy drinks, juices, even and especially alcohol. If you want to do your homemade juices, that's absolutely fine. I don't mind those. But the store-bought juices, no, you need to avoid those. Definitely we need to manage stress. And if you want to add things to your diet, well, you can add lots of plant-based food, lots of fruit, vegetables, whole grains, seeds. All of that is wonderful for you. And if you have an autoimmune disease, you must definitely be taking high-dose vitamin D3. Okay, so that's me covering cancer and autoimmunity. Tomorrow, we're going to be looking at the heart. We're going to teach you how to guard your heart. If you know anybody with high blood pressure, heart disease, any of those conditions, be here tomorrow and we will sort you out and help you to prevent and reverse it. Until then, thank you very much.